October 1929. The wind off Lake Erie carried something different that morning, colder than usual, sharper, like it knew. Walter Briggs pulled his coat tighter and walked past the row of storefronts on Elm Street. The bakery was quiet, the tailor's light was off, and outside the First National Bank a line had already formed, long before the doors opened. Men in working clothes, women clutching purses, eyes that didn't blink. He had seen worried faces before, but not like this. The newspaper boy on the corner was shouting something about Wall Street, about numbers falling, about fortunes gone overnight. Walter bought a copy, folded it once, and tucked it under his arm without reading it. He already knew. Everyone knew. Inside the factory that morning, the talk was everywhere. Henderson from the line said his brother-in-law had lost everything, savings, investments, gone in 48 hours. Murphy said his neighbor was crying in the kitchen. Two men near the water station spoke in whispers, calculating in their heads what they had left. Walter listened. He said nothing. At lunch, he sat alone at the far end of the break table. He opened his tin pail, ate slowly, and pulled out a small notebook from his front shirt pocket. Worn edges, blue cover, the kind you'd find in any 5-and-dime store for a nickel. He opened it to a fresh page, wrote the date at the top, then a single number, then another. Quiet, steady, unhurried. The man next to him leaned over. "What's that, Walt?" Walter didn't look up right away. When he did, he just said, "It's how we don't end up in that line." Nobody knew what he meant. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Walter Briggs was not a remarkable man. He earned $31 a week at the Lakeside manufacturing plant. He had a wife named Ruth, 2 children, and a rented house on the corner of Maplewood and 3rd. The roof leaked slightly near the chimney. He had been meaning to fix it since spring. Like most working families in 1929, the Briggs household lived carefully, not in poverty, but close enough to it that one bad month felt dangerous. Ruth managed the kitchen. Walter managed the worry. Neither of them spoke much about money, because speaking about it made it feel smaller than it already was. Then one evening in September, just weeks before the crash, Walter came home from work and set something on the kitchen table. A notebook. Blue cover, ruled pages, 12 cents at Harmon's drugstore. Ruth looked at it, then at him. "What's this for?" she asked. Walter pulled out a chair, sat down slowly, and said the words that would quietly change everything for their family. "I want to see where it goes," he said, "every penny, before it disappears." Ruth didn't say much that night, but she didn't put the notebook away either. And if you haven't already, and this kind of story speaks to you, consider subscribing, because this one is just getting started. How did he even begin? Most people think budgeting means control. Walter didn't start there. He started somewhere quieter, somewhere most people skip entirely. He started with just watching. That first week, he wrote nothing about what he should spend. No limits, no categories, no rules. He simply recorded what already happened. The trolley fare, the tobacco, the bread, the 2 pennies Ruth spent on thread at Woolworth's. Everything, without judgment. Many households of that era, according to accounts of the time, commonly began financial awareness this way, not by restricting first, but by observing first, seeing the full picture before trying to change any of it. There's a reason that worked, because you cannot fix what you have never truly faced. Walter faced it, line by line, night by night, sitting at that kitchen table after the children were asleep, pencil in hand, the house completely quiet. He wasn't building a budget yet. He was building a mirror. And what that mirror showed him, slowly, over those first 2 weeks, was something modern budgeting apps try to replicate with colorful charts and instant notifications. That strange, uncomfortable feeling of seeing yourself clearly. No app designed it better than a nickel notebook and 10 minutes of silence. But the mirror only works if you're honest with it. Walter was. Almost entirely. But the grocery store would test that idea. The grocery store on Clement Avenue smelled like sawdust and overripe peaches. Ruth went every Thursday morning. Same route, same stores, same basket over her arm. She knew the prices the way she knew her children's faces, without thinking, without looking twice. Flour was 18 cents for 5 pounds. Eggs were 22 cents a dozen. Coffee had gone up again, which she mentioned to Walter twice, and he nodded both times without quite hearing. Walter began calling it the daily bread column in his notebook. A simple section, just food, just what the family ate and what it cost to feed them. The first week the numbers surprised him. Not because it was large, but because it was uneven. Some days Ruth spent carefully and came home with change. Other days something slipped in, a tin of sardines, a small bag of sugar they didn't strictly need, and the column quietly swelled. Neither of them had noticed before, because before it was all one blurry sum at the end of the week. Now it had a shape. Walter showed Ruth the column one evening. She studied it for a long moment, finger tracing the numbers slowly. "We spent 30 cents more than last week," she said. "Yes," said Walter. "On what?" He pointed to a line. Tuesday, a small number, something almost invisible. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then she laughed softly, not embarrassed, just honest. That small laugh was the beginning of something. But food wasn't the expense quietly draining the ledger. There is something that happens when you write a number by hand, something that doesn't happen when you tap a screen. Walter noticed it around the 3rd week. He would sit down after supper, open the blue notebook, and pick up his pencil. And in that small moment, before the first number was written, something in him slowed down. Not dramatically, not like a revelation, just slower. The pencil had weight. The page had texture. The act of forming each digit carefully in his own handwriting made every number feel real in a way that handing over coins at a counter never quite did. Many who practiced similar habits in that era often described it the same way. Writing money down made it mean something. It transformed spending from a moment into a record, from a feeling into a fact. Walter wasn't just tracking dollars. He was having a conversation with himself. Every night, 10 minutes, no interruptions. Some might call it meditation. Walter would never have used that word. He would have said he was simply paying attention. But attention paid consistently and quietly over weeks does something to a person. It changes what they notice, what they feel before a purchase. That half-second pause that appears almost on its own between wanting something and reaching for the money. Today, a card tap takes less than a second. A one-click purchase even less. Walter's pencil took longer, on purpose, and that extra moment, that small, almost invisible delay, was doing something to his decisions that he hadn't yet fully understood, but he was beginning to feel it. Saturday evenings had a rhythm in the Briggs house. Ruth would clear the supper dishes. Walter would bring the notebook from the shelf above the icebox, always the same shelf, always the same spot. The children, Clara, aged 9, and Thomas, aged 6, knew what it meant when the blue notebook came out. They would pull their chairs closer without being asked. This was simply what Saturday evenings were. Walter would read the week's entries aloud, not quickly, not like a recitation, slowly, the way a man reads something that matters. The trolley fare, the coal delivery, the mended boot, the grocery column Ruth had helped keep. Clara would sometimes do the addition herself, small fingers counting on the edge of the table, lips moving silently. Thomas mostly listened, though he understood little, but he sat there, present, part of it. Ruth would occasionally stop Walter mid-entry. "Wait, what was that Tuesday expense?" And they would discuss it, calmly, without blame, just two people trying to understand where their life had gone that week, dollar by dollar. Many families of that era, according to household accounts of the time, treated this kind of weekly review as something close to a ritual, not a chore, not an argument, a shared moment of clarity in a world that offered very little of it. When the numbers balanced, there was a quiet satisfaction around that table, small but real. When they didn't balance, and sometimes they didn't, the family would sit a little longer, thinking together. The notebook never judged, it only showed. It started with a radio, not a large one, a small tabletop model in the window of Dalton's Electronics on 5th Street. Walter passed it every morning on his way to the plant. Every morning he slowed down slightly. Every morning he kept walking. $14.50, nearly half a week's wages. He did not write it in the expense column. He wrote it somewhere else entirely, a section he had quietly added to the back pages of the notebook. 2 words at the top of that page, underlined once. Wants, someday. Ruth had her own entry on that page, a wool coat she had admired in the window of Henderson's department store. Soft gray, belted at the waist. She mentioned it only once, lightly, the way women of that time often mentioned things they had already decided they could not have. Walter wrote it down anyway. The wants column was not a wish list. It was a promise with conditions. Each Saturday, after the balancing was done, if there was anything left, anything at all after necessities, a small portion went into a separate envelope tucked inside the notebook's back cover. Not much, sometimes only 30 cents, sometimes less. Many households commonly used similar methods at the time, setting aside small fixed amounts toward larger goals with patience that modern installment culture would later make feel unnecessary. But Walter understood something those installment plans didn't advertise. Saving toward something felt different than owing for something. One made you lighter. The other made you careful in ways that sometimes kept you awake at night. The envelope grew slowly. Walter checked it every Saturday. The radio got closer, week by week. The boots gave out in November. Left sole coming away from the upper near the toe. Walter noticed it on a Tuesday morning, that familiar flapping sound on wet pavement, the cold seeping in through the gap by afternoon. New boots were $3.20 at Garfield's. Walter wrote nothing in the expense column that week. Instead, he went to see old Pete Sobieski on Birch Lane, a cobbler who had been fixing shoes in that same basement shop since before Walter was born. The smell of leather and rubber cement hit you at the top of the stairs. Pete looked at the boot for 30 seconds. 70 cents, he said. Ready Thursday. Walter wrote 70 cents in a column he had added quietly between the daily bread and the wants sections. He called it simply repairs. Every household of that era commonly kept things running far longer than comfort might suggest was reasonable. Coats were relined, chair legs were re-glued, kitchen pots were soldered rather than replaced. A thing being worn or imperfect was not considered a reason to discard it. It was considered a reason to attend to it. The repair column over 6 months told a quiet story. 70 cents for boots, 40 cents for Clara's school bag strap, $1.10 for the kitchen pipe fitting, 30 cents for the umbrella mechanism Ruth had been meaning to address since spring. Total repairs that year, less than $4. Replacements would have cost closer to $12. Walter never spoke about this proudly. He simply wrote it down. But the number on the page had its own kind of eloquence. Walter was not a mathematician. He had finished school at 14, the way most working boys of his generation did. His arithmetic was practical, enough for the factory floor, enough for the grocery column, enough to know when something didn't add up. But one evening in January, something made him pause. He had been moving small amounts, whatever remained after the Saturday balance, into a savings account at the People's Savings Bank on Monroe Street. Not regularly enough to call it a habit, not confidently enough to call it a plan, just quietly whenever the notebook showed a small surplus. That January evening, he received a paper statement in the mail. He sat with it for a long time. The bank had added interest, a small number, modest enough to seem almost meaningless at first glance, but Walter didn't glance. He stared at it. Then he opened the notebook to a fresh page and began writing something he had never written before, a projection. Simple arithmetic. What if this amount grew at the same rate? What would it look like in 1 year, in 3? He had no calculator, no chart, just a pencil, a ruler, and a page ruled into rough columns by hand. The numbers were not large, they were not dramatic, but they moved in only one direction. Many savers of that era often described a similar quiet shock, the moment they understood that patience itself had a return, that doing nothing, once money was set aside, was actually doing something. Walter sat with that page for nearly an hour. Then he wrote a number in the bottom corner, circled it once, said nothing to anyone. It was Ruth who brought home the red pencil. She hadn't planned it. She had simply needed one for Clara's schoolwork and bought an extra by habit. It sat on the kitchen shelf for 2 weeks, unused, next to the blue notebook. Then came February. A difficult month. Coal prices had risen. Thomas had needed a doctor's visit. Nothing serious, but not free. And Walter, on a tired Thursday evening, had stopped at Sullivan's and spent 60 cents on something he could not entirely justify. He sat down that Saturday with the notebook. The numbers didn't balance. Without quite deciding to, he reached for the red pencil. He drew a small line beneath the week's total, wrote the shortfall in red, just the number, nothing dramatic, but something happened when he saw it. The black ink entries felt neutral, informational, simply what had occurred. The red number felt different. It had a quality to it that the black numbers didn't, a visibility, a weight. It sat on the page and looked back at him in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable. He left it there, did not erase it, did not cover it. Behavioral researchers studying financial habits many decades later would describe this phenomenon with careful language, that visual cues tied to financial outcomes often influence future decisions more powerfully than abstract awareness alone, that seeing overspending in a distinct color creates a mild but genuine psychological response. Walter didn't know any of that. He only knew that the following week he thought about the red number twice before spending anything he wasn't certain about. The red pencil stayed on the shelf, within reach. Ruth had her own system. Walter knew about the blue notebook. He did not know about the small yellow notepad Ruth kept in the kitchen drawer beneath the dish towels. It had begun simply enough. She had started writing down what was in the pantry, not for any grand reason, just to stop buying things they already had. Flour, cornmeal, salt, tinned tomatoes, dried beans, each item listed with a small tally beside it, how much remained, when it was last restocked, what it had cost. Many households of that era commonly maintained informal kitchen inventories this way, according to domestic accounts of the time. Not as an economic strategy, simply as sense, the kind of quiet, practical intelligence that kept families fed through uncertain months without anyone calling it wisdom. But Ruth's yellow notepad was doing something beyond inventory. It was tracking price changes. She had noticed over several months that certain staples were creeping upward, not dramatically, just steadily, a penny here, 2 cents there, the kind of movement that felt invisible unless you had written last month's price somewhere you could actually check. One evening she showed Walter a comparison she had made. Same item, 3 months apart. The difference was small, but multiplied across everything the kitchen consumed in a year became a number that surprised them both. "We should buy more flour when the price drops," Ruth said simply. Walter looked at her notepad, then at his notebook, then at her. "You've been doing this longer than I have," he said. Ruth just folded the notepad and put it back under the dish towels. Walter heard it first from an older man at the plant. Henderson, 62 years old, 38 years on the factory floor, hands like worn leather, never missed a day of work that anyone could remember. They were eating lunch on the loading dock when Henderson said it, quietly, without looking up from his pail. "First dollar you earn belongs to you, not the landlord, not the grocer, you." Walter chewed slowly. "How much?" Henderson thought for a moment. Some people said 10 cents of every dollar. Some said less. Didn't much matter the number. Mattered that it happened first, before anything else got paid. Walter had heard variations of this before. Most working men had. It circulated in barber shops and break rooms and church basements the way certain ideas do, quietly, without any single source. But he had never written it down. That evening he opened the notebook to a fresh page and did something deliberate. Before recording any expense, before noting the week's wages, he wrote a single line at the top. "Set aside first. Spend from what remains." He drew a box around it. It sounds simple. It is simple. But simple and easy are not the same thing, and Walter understood that now in a way he hadn't before the notebook existed. Because the notebook showed him something honest. That money set aside after all spending was often nothing. That whatever felt like leftover rarely was. Taking the 10 cents first changed the arithmetic completely. Not the income, not the expenses, just the order.